Thank you for joining us. We've got two brilliant speakers, and I'll just tell you how I met these people. You'll know, some of you will know that I spend my Friday evenings in pubs, not for any other reason other than to drop in and invite people to come along and raise any concern they have. I met Neil because he came to see me about the opportunities, but also challenges facing mining and the training of people involved in mining in Cornwall. And then I met Hazel because someone else came to see me because they wanted to know a bit more about geothermal, and Hazel was one I needed to talk to find out all about it. So they're both going to talk about their perspective on the opportunities facing us in Cornwall and how we navigate some of the concerns that might be there around the natural environment. So, but I'm going to hand first to Pippa, who wants to tell you about something you can get involved in the autumn. Thanks, Pippa.
Well, hello everybody, and thanks for joining. I've just today had an email from Carbon Neutral Cornwall to say that they will be offering virtual climate literacy training to community, voluntary and climate action groups, and also in particular to town and parish councils, I think. So they haven't particularly sent a link to it. They've sent a form, but if you were to get in touch with with the Cornwall Council Hive, I think you could learn more about it. Or if you want to get in touch with me, I'll forward you their email, and I'll put my email address in the chat. So if you do want to, I think it's a great thing for community groups to be part of. So if you do want to get in touch with it, let me know.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Hazel now. So Hazel, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself completely, because then you can put in the bits you want us to know and leave out the bits that I might read that you might not think is relevant. So, but Hazel, thanks for your time. We really do appreciate the time people give, particularly at the end of the working day. And you've got the time to just set out what your business is doing and what the opportunities are, and actually why it is really important as part of the solution for decarbonising not just Cornwall, but wherever else geothermal is possible. So over to you, Hazel. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that I've got some slides. I'll try not to bore you with too many. I'm a bit of a PowerPoint making machine these days, so apologies that there are a few. Hopefully you can see this PowerPoint. So yeah, my name is Hazel Farndale. I am the Business Development Manager for Geothermal Engineering Limited. So we are the developers, owners and operators of the United Downs site, which hopefully next year will have the UK's first geothermal power plant on the site. So on the left here, you've just got a nice image, which I always think sums it up really nicely, because you've got the new rig tower towering above the old mining industry of Cornwall, which I just think is really, really beautiful. So I'm going to dig down into the basics a little bit. I won't tell you everything there is to know about geothermal. I don't even know it. But just to start on what geothermal energy is. To put simply, it's using the natural heat that's within the earth to harness the energy at the surface. And this can be several different things. So this can be shallow geothermal. Some people might know ground source heat pumps. On the left of this image, you've got a little heat pump there. So you're talking even just a couple of meters, that's geothermal energy, all the way through to generating electricity, which generally you have to drill down to a couple of kilometers, or even at United Downs, we'll drill down to 5 kilometers depth to get the fluid and the temperatures that we need. So there's lots of different types that I won't drill into now, but they are all basically on the same principle. And we know that geothermal works all over the world. So I think this map sums it up really nicely. These are all of the operating power plants that are powered by geothermal around the world today. So you can see a lot of them are concentrated in volcanic areas. You've got a lot throughout Indonesia, Japan, Central America, even a few in the East African Rift Valley. But it's not just volcanic regions. You've got a number throughout Europe and Australia as well, which are definitely not that volcanic. But geothermal has been going around for a long, long time. So the first power plant was actually in Italy, in an area of Tuscany, and that was built more than 100 years ago, and it's still operational today. So it's not a new technology; it's just new to us. So a bit about why Cornwall is perfect for it. So Cornwall has a unique geology for the UK. It has these huge granite bodies that I'm sure a lot of you know about, stretching all the way from Dartmoor over in Devon, all the way up to the Isles of Scilly. So they underlie basically the entirety of the peninsula. And that Granite is radiogenic, which means it's got minerals in it that have isotopes that decay over time, and it's this process that releases heat. So it gives us what we call a much higher geothermal gradient than the rest of the country. So that just simply means the amount of thermal energy is increasing as we drill down. So you can see on the left-hand diagram here, the average UK geothermal gradient is about 26 degrees Celsius per kilometre you drill down. Whereas here in Cornwall, we're looking at more like 33 to 35 degrees C, in some places even higher. So it's got really exciting potential. That's the reason we're here in Cornwall. Doesn't mean you couldn't do it in other parts of the UK, just means it takes more money, more drilling, more time. The other thing that Cornwall has is these big fracture zones. So they cross the granite throughout the whole way up and down the peninsula. They cross it, and that means that we have these pathways that the fluid, the hot fluid that's down underneath the ground, can move through. And you need both the temperature and the movement to allow us to pull the energy out, essentially. But what we find really exciting about geothermal energy is that it's a single resource. It is essentially hot water down beneath the ground that gives us multiple opportunities. So here on the left is just a nice little summary of a lot of the different things you can do with it. Because essentially anything you need heat for, you can use geothermal for. So you've got power plants, you've got processing of food, you've got aquaculture, greenhouses. The world's your oyster. You can even use it for cooling. So if you had a big data center, for example, you can cool your data center with it. So at United Downs, we have three things primarily that we're targeting. So our first aim, as I've said, is to be the UK's first geothermal power plant. That is always number one, and that's what we are built off of. However, once you've extracted enough heat to generate electricity, there's still temperature left over. So the fluid will actually still be about 80 degrees Celsius once you've generated electricity. So you can use that heat in a lot of different forms, and you can use it to do a lot of different things. And what's really exciting at United Downs as well is that we have identified really high lithium concentrations in the water. So it's dissolved essentially in the water, and we can then extract it and use it for the growing industry of electric vehicles. So I'm just going to start a little bit of background about electricity generation. So why are we excited by it? Firstly, it's low carbon. So a 5 megawatt plant can save more than 700,000 tons of carbon compared to an equivalent gas plant. So it's a really vital part of helping us transition to net zero. It's also really low impact. So in terms of the amount of land it takes up a lot less than any other onshore renewable energy. So you've got this diagram on the right of the footprints, that is to scale, showing you how many acres per gigawatt hour, per gigawatt even, that it takes up. And finally, the one that people often don't think about is that it is 24/7. It is that the temperature down there is never changing. It is a secure energy supply, no matter the time of day or the weather at the surface. So you're never going to generate enough electricity to power the whole of the UK with geothermal. We could never claim such a thing, but it's really vital to even out the peaks and troughs that other renewable energies have. So the basic premise, I won't read all the text here, I can always send on slides if people are interested, but the basic premise of generating electricity is that you suck up the hot water from underneath the ground from a production well on the right-hand side. What we will do at United Downs is use a binary power plant. So the heat from that fluid will be contained within a closed loop. It'll be used to heat up a secondary working fluid. That fluid turns to vapor at a lower temperature than standard water and will flash to steam. And it's that steam which we can then use to turn a turbine and generate electricity. We won't even have big pylons. This diagram is a poor show. It will go into underground cables and go off into the national grid. So the working fluid is kept within its own closed loop, it's cooled down and it goes back into a cycle. Then the geothermal fluid from under the ground will also just get re-injected into the ground. Before that happens, we can take it off and use it for other things. So bottom left here, you've got an example of a power plant in rural France. Now you can see that you've got a sort of red roofed building, just like a barn. You've got some big cooling fans behind that, and you've got some low-level pipework as well. And that's the basic fundamentals of any geothermal power plant. So just to give it a little bit of a flavour, there is some pictures of geothermal power plants that are sort of similar to the ones that we will be developing here in Cornwall. You've got one in Turkey in the top left. You've got some big pipework there. So what's really important to understand is that every geothermal power plant is developed specific to the resource, depending on the temperature you can get, the flow rate you can get, but not insignificantly also the environment you're in. So we can make it look however we want essentially to fit in. So as I say, the one in France is designed to look like quite a small barn, but then with some cooling fans next door to it. You've got it in the bottom left here in the Azores as well. That's got a small plant. They're trying to become fully self-sufficient for energy. And then we've got an artist's impression in the bottom right of what we would like our sites to look like in Cornwall. So we have, again, all of the sort of noisy equipment, the generators, the turbines will be housed in a soundproof barn structure, and we'll keep everything as low as we possibly can. So nothing more than about 5 meters height, nothing more than a 2-story home would be. So then to move on to heating and cooling, basically everything else in the diagram on the left is a form of heating and cooling. So you can use it to do any number of things, which is really exciting for Cornwall because it means that some sort of really innovative heat-intensive industries are being attracted to Cornwall by its unique geothermal resource. So on the left, you've got the aim of a nice guy called Matt, who's hoping to have the first geothermal rum distillery here in Cornwall. That's the world's first geothermal rum distillery and maturation as well. As you know, he's a really passionate guy. It's really exciting to see. There's also then the potential for district heating schemes. So these schemes can actually be implemented more than 10 kilometres away from the geothermal power plant itself. So you can run an insulated pipe out to new housing estates, out to hospitals, anything that needs heating. And Cornwall Council are actually currently raising funds to connect our United Downs site to a district heating system at Langgarth Garden Village. And finally, geothermal greenhouses are really common in places like the Netherlands. So these are enabling them to generate much greater yields than they would have, and to have a year-round supply of all sorts of fruits and vegetables. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity for sort of improving our resilience to the food supply chain and reducing our reliance on the rest of the world for our food. And then to touch on direct lithium extraction. So you can see here, it uses the heat from the geothermal fluid as well, and it will use the lithium from within that fluid. So why are we excited by it? So traditionally, lithium is mined out of the ground. You know, that's happened in a couple of ways. So there's hard rock mining. On the left, you've got an image of a huge open cast mine or a quarry. And bottom left, you've got brine evaporation ponds. So those are currently the 2 ways that we get lithium in this world. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the lithium demand is hugely increasing at the moment due to electric vehicles and battery usage, which is great for the sort of the climate change rhetoric, but it comes with its own need for resources as well. So what's great about being able to combine the fact that we can generate electricity and generate heating is that we can potentially get lithium out as well. Getting it straight from the fluid means that we use a lot less land, we generate no extra emissions at all, and we use a lot less water and energy as well in the process. When you think of brine evaporation, you're having to lose all of that water just to get the minerals that are precipitating out. And beyond that, so lithium extraction, it's a new technology. It is only in trial stages. So on the right-hand side here, you've got the trial plant that was set up by a joint venture between ourselves and Cornish Lithium at United Downs. You can see everything's really done in small containerized units, and they're going to be powered by the renewable energy from the geothermal power plant as well. And then inside the containers on the left-hand side, you can just see it's a whole load of pipework. So we keep it all very low level. If you want to increase the scale of the operation, you just add some more containers. There's no waste products, there's no emissions, and there's no water loss from the process either. But can development ever really be positive? Now, I appreciate I'm completely biased here, but I think it's important to point out that all of this sort of development can keep sort of local resources and keep everything benefiting the local people. So, for example, the United Downs project, we spent more than £1.5 million in the local economy, and that's across a huge range of businesses. So big part of our ethos is to try and keep as much local as we can, from accommodation for our contractors that come in, food and hospitality, all of the scaffolding and building supplies that we needed, the cranes, the noise monitoring, you name it, everything we could do in Cornwall, we did in Cornwall. We also have a community fund. So we deposit £20,000 per well that we drill into a community fund, which is managed separately to us. It's professionally managed to ensure that all of the money is distributed fairly across local community projects. So these are just some examples of what we spent it on at United Downs, and every project will have this. So we like to give it to projects that are sort of community focused, that sort of bring a cohesive, that bring communities together, but also have a sort of sustainability bent. You know, the tree planting, anything like that is excellent. But as I say, it's managed elsewhere, and we do it in conjunction with the parish councils as well, and anyone in the parish who wants to sort of be on the board. Education is a really, really important part of it as well. We know that geothermal is brand new to the UK. People don't know about it very much. So it's important for us to get out there and talk about it as much as we can. There's actually only about 9 of us in our team. We are a small Cornish company, but we get out there as much as we possibly can. So we have a number of resources that we provide to schools. We also give a number of talks and webinars like this one. We've generated a lot of careers events as well, really trying to inspire young people to get out there for all ages, from primary school through to university levels. And we also, when COVID hasn't been around, have had a lot of site visits. So throughout operations, we have monthly site visits for anyone in the area to drop in, ask us questions and see what's going on. And we will be instigating that, as long as we don't have another pandemic, at all of our future sites as well. And finally, we're really committed to limiting our impact on both our neighbours and on the environment. So it's been a really vital part of planning all of our future sites to make sure that we have an environmental plan in place. So we are targeting a 30% biodiversity net gain on site. That means from what it is now, it will be 30% more. We will be creating and maintaining vital wildlife corridors. We will also be not emitting anything, whether that's particles, smells or gases. We also have to follow strict regulations. I think that's really important to hammer home. It is, you know, whilst people would love to go out and drill wherever they like, there's no way anyone could ever do that. So we have to talk very closely with the Health and Safety Executive, the Environment Agency, of course, the Council and the Oil and Gas Authority. Those are the 4 major ones, and particularly the Environment Agency ensure that absolutely everything we do cannot harm the environment. So we also have sort of wildlife enhancing schemes both on and off site, and every step of the way, again, we work with specialist environmental consultants. So it's really important to us that we make sure that we not only are generating green, clean energy, but we're also helping the local environment as well as the global one. So I've probably talked for a bit too long now. Sure, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, but please, I really want to hammer home, anyone ever has concerns, contact us directly. All of our contact details are on our website or on social media, of course, and give us a call. You know, we love talking to people. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Hazel. And we ought to have a conversation sometime about community energy networks, which is something I've been supporting in government, which is probably very helpful, but it'd be interesting to see your take on that. So before we hand over to Neil, just remember that you can put questions, just identify yourself and then a question, if you've got a question or even a comment, in the chat function, and then we'll come to you straight after Neil's finished. But Neil, thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Derek. My name is Neil Wood. I'm Cornish born and bred, although I did escape for a couple of decades before I came back. I lead a kind of a double life. On the one hand, I'm an academic of quite a few years now at Cornwall School of Mines. And on the other hand, I run a company called Geodefinition Limited, which specialises in near-surface geophysics and keeps me very firmly in touch with the real world outside of academia. Now, clearly, I have some environmental credentials, otherwise I don't suppose Derek would have invited me here. But I would describe myself very much as a realist in this. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, which is the role that mining has to play, and perhaps provoke a few controversial thoughts on the subject. So I'm going to share my screen and throw a few PowerPoints at you, but I promise you it's very, very few. So let's see if I can share my screen. Excellent. Hopefully you can see this. And I guess the starting message is that there's an awful lot we can all do. We've just seen about geothermal. I have myself recently been thinking about solar panels and storage capacity at home. But what's important to realize is that simply by going out and buying some solar panels or investing in an electric car, we're not simply taking a couple of steps forwards towards sustainability, because for every 2 or 3 steps forward, we're going to take 1 or 2 steps backwards. And those steps backwards are, if you like, the cost of doing what it is that makes life more sustainable. And There are a few approaches to sustainability. One is what I would call the caveman approach, which is to go back to absolutely zero impact. But with the world population as it is and our standards of living as they are, that's not going to happen. Which means that the approach to sustainability invariably is technology-based. And technology is hungry. Technology consumes power, it consumes electronics, it consumes resources. So anything that we do in the way of investing in new technology to try and make us more sustainable has a sustainability cost embedded within it. Now, I'm going to focus very much on the mining element of this, which is pretty much anything we produce in the way of equipment, in the way of transmission capability for power, it's mined. And mining comes in many forms, and we need many, many different metals. It's often said that there's up to 100 different elements embodied just in one mobile phone. You may have seen something on television in the last day or two about tantalum and tantalum mining. And most people have never even heard of tantalum, but touchscreens do not work without it. And yet much of the tantalum production comes from conflict areas in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it makes a lot of sense to ask ourselves, how sustainable is the mining that we're turning to power the sustainability revolution? Now, something else you might have seen in the news, perhaps recently, maybe over the last year or two, is that we're not simply looking at the Earth as a potential source of metals these days. People are starting to look at asteroids, for instance, as a source of metals. But I think that's still some way off. And until we actually get into space to start getting our hands on the precious stuff, we are confined to mining on Earth. And the problems we have with mining on Earth are that it is, by its very nature, energy intensive. The mining industry is one of the biggest consumers of energy on the planet. And if you think about it, that's logical, because if you're going to dig out vast quantities of rock and grind it to a powder, that's a lot of energy. The other thing to worry about is that there's a very considerable environmental impact with mining. Now, it's very easy to say that all mining is absolutely horrific, but that's probably not entirely true. All mining is going to have an environmental cost, but the scale of that cost will vary enormously depending upon how that mining is done and the standards that are adhered to, both in the mining, the processing, and the transportation and disposal of materials and waste. So there will be an environmental cost, but the extent of that environmental cost could be minimal or it could be huge. Now, one of the problems we're faced with here is that so much of mining is done out of sight. And it's kind of human nature that if it's happening out of sight, we tend not to worry about it. We don't have to go back too many years to a situation where expensive branded trainers were being manufactured in developing countries using child labor. It's only once people started becoming aware of this that pressure grew and those brands decided that they would up their game and start putting in more acceptable processes for the manufacture of the products. One of the problems we have with mining is that it happens in places we don't see it. We tend only to learn about mining when something horrible has gone wrong and it makes the news. What we don't appreciate is just how much mining is going on around the world. What we should be caring about is not just the fact that mining is happening in certain places. That's inevitable. If we're going to demand metals, mining has to happen. What we need to be concerned about is what I would call the quality of that mining. In other words, how much energy and how much environmental impact is that mining having relative to each unit of production. So I know that time is precious, so I've tried to distill this down to a few basic points. And one of the big issues we have here is that in Western developed countries, we are the big consumers here. And we have the expertise, we have developed mining technologies. We know how to mine in environmentally friendly ways. You don't have to look too far around Cornwall to see the relics of mining in days when sustainability and environmental impact was not an issue. But these days it is, and we care about it. However, whilst in the West we understand these things, most mining these days is done in lesser developed countries. And there are several reasons for that. One is that in the West, we have exhausted many of the easily accessible mineral deposits already, which means that many countries now have mined out most of what there is to mine, and there is little potential. In lesser developed countries, we are still able to find and exploit new resources, although those are starting to run out in many cases. But one of the other reasons that mining happens in lesser developed countries is that regulation is much less strict, which makes it much easier for mining to happen. And if it's easier for mining to happen with less regulation, the temptation of the miner operators then is to exploit that lax legislation and regulation and not worry too much about the environmental impact. But because it's happening in far-flung corners of the world, the consumers in the West mostly don't see what's going on. Now, in the background as well, over the last 10 or 15 years, something that's been going on in the mining industry, amongst others, is that China has been steadily increasing its control over a wide range of strategic resources. You may have heard about their Belt and Road program. And a lot of that is about securing access to strategic resources, which A, gives them security of supply, and B, makes it much harder for other parts of the world to access that supply. And I think we've all seen with recent developments with Russia and Ukraine that there are some strategic risks when we are dependent upon something which is controlled by another superpower. So for me, it's vitally important we get our act together to make sure that mining is properly done wherever it is done in the world. And something we have to face up to is that we have a wonderful opportunity here in Cornwall, in that we still have a lot of resource which is not being mined out. And we have a lot of metals in the ground which were never exploited in times gone by. We've already heard about lithium and the potential of lithium recovery here. We have a great deal of lithium in the ground, and if we can extract it effectively, it could become extremely important to UK PLC. Now, at the moment, a lot of lithium is mined in places like northern China, Inner Mongolia. And again, there was a piece on the BBC a couple of weeks ago about the enormous environmental harm that is being done by the mining practices in this very remote part of the world, but it's poisoning huge areas of territory. The opportunity that we have here is to mine materials close to home that we can use for the UK economy. We've all heard about food miles. Well, we should also be thinking about metal miles, because we are huge consumers of metals. And if we can produce them at home, rather than bringing them in from halfway around the world, we are massively reducing the carbon footprint associated with that. Now, if we can mine intelligently, cleverly, we minimize the energy requirements, we minimize the environmental impacts, and we actually get the best bang for our buck when it comes to investing in sustainable technology. So rather than saying, look, we've invested in some technology and we've got a massive sustainability win here, and not worrying about the massive sustainability costs somewhere on the other side of the world, if we do it here in the UK, we can see what's going on, we can control it, we can measure it, we can get the maximum benefit. So one of the things that has concerned me lately is that sadly, it is no longer possible to study an undergraduate mining engineering degree here in the United Kingdom. When I was a student, I had a choice of places to go where I could go to a school of mines. Now, there are none left offering undergraduate mining degrees, which means that here in the West, we are losing our capacity to educate people who can undertake mining effectively, sustainably, and with an environmental conscience. So the big question for me is, does anybody really care about this? Or is it simply a case of let's all buy electric vehicles and it's job done? For me, buying an electric vehicle or putting solar panels on my roof is not job done. It's job done when we actually ensure that the energy and materials going into those technologies are having the minimum environmental impact. Right, well, that's been a bit of a blast from me. I hope it hasn't sounded too pessimistic. I'm mildly optimistic for the future, but only mildly. So thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Neil. So I'm going to do stick your comments, questions in the chat function. You'll see there that Pippa has put a link, or at least some information regarding your climate literacy. But Neil, I'm going to challenge you back, man. So I completely share and understand what you're saying. But is there a danger, I'm just playing devil's advocate now, is there a danger that we extract these precious minerals as tin, copper, etc., lithium, and then have to send it halfway around the world to get it processed? And then if that's the case, what have we gained?
Yeah, that's really important. And I'd also like to pick up on a question in the chat there about recycling, if I may. It's vitally important that if we are looking to exploit minerals here in the UK, to get the maximum benefit from it, both environmentally and economically, it's not just about digging stuff out of the ground. In fact, in many ways, digging stuff out of the ground is the easy bit. The real key to this is how we process it, because processing of minerals is both energy intensive, expensive, and done in large quantities, which means if we've got to ship it halfway around the world, right, that's an awful lot of metal miles. In fact, it's an awful lot of waste rock miles as well. And then we have to bring it back again in its finished form. And at the same time, we're probably shipping it off to some lesser developed country where the processing is likely to be done to lower environmental standards than it would be here. So for me, it's really important when we think about mining that we're not simply thinking about digging stuff out of the ground, we're thinking about the processing of it as well. And if we've got the processing into the base metal, we can then feed our own secondary industries to actually manufacture stuff from it again. And I think that one of the sad aspects of post-war Britain has been the decline in our manufacturing technology. And I think one of the reasons for that has been the decline in the supply of raw materials. But if I can come back to the point that was made in the chat there about recycling,
yeah,
recycling is a very, usually a very simple and cost-effective way of accessing materials. However, the processing of metals out of recycled goods may not always be that simple. But the big problem with recycling is that there simply isn't enough material to feed future demand. And there are two reasons for that. One reason is that we never recover 100% of what we're using. Whatever recycling rate we achieve, it will never be 100%. But the bigger factor is that our demands for material are increasing year on year. What we recycle is waste that's been used a number of years in the past, which means that the volume available for recycling, even if we could achieve 100% recycling rate, would never be enough to satisfy current demand, because current demand is constantly increasing. So recycling has a role to play, but it will only ever be a part of the equation.
Thanks for that. Hazel, can you quickly pick up on this in the chat? There's a question about, are you involved in the geothermal at Eden?
Yeah, of course. No, we're not, is the short answer. That's done by a separate entity called Eden Geothermal. We obviously have close links with them. We're both pioneering the industry. So it's been really great to see them moving forward and see them completing their well and doing testing. But no, they're completely separate.
Thanks, Hazel. Rupert, I'm going to ask you, if you're happy to read your question, please do. And Neil, I'm going to direct it towards you. You've kind of touched on it already, actually, but you might want to just unpack it a little bit more. But I'm going to try and keep questions and answers really short so we can get plenty in. So, Rupert.
Hi, thanks, Derek. Yeah, thanks ever so much for the talks. That was really, really interesting. And I had no idea such things were happening at United Downs at such an advanced stage. That's just brilliant. My question is around the sort of paradox, I guess, that we find ourselves in, with many commentators thinking that pursuing business as usual, which I think is essentially what we're talking about, the business as usual socio-economic model, despite a progressive transition to green technologies, will inevitably result in a failure to prevent catastrophic climate and ecological breakdown, and also a failure to address the global socio-economic inequity. Does the panel agree that a truly sustainable future lies somewhere between the caveman and the business as usual sort of paradigms or models of living? And if so, how are we going to rationalize that with our insatiable demand for economic growth?
Neil.
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I'm going to go into slightly pessimistic mode now. I think in many respects, the human race has certain lemming-like tendencies, in that we all want to enjoy life and have the highest standard of living we can, and we all assume that somebody else is going to fix the planet. It's sad to say that we enjoy our standards of living here in the Western world, but if everybody in the world comes up to the same standard of living, the same energy usage, the same level of consumption as us here in the Western world, then sustainability is, as far as I can see, pretty much impossible. So yes, there has to be some kind of a happy medium between the caveman and business as usual. I think the best we're likely to achieve in practice is a slowing down of the problem. I think it's unlikely that we will achieve true sustainability. And I hope that doesn't sound overly pessimistic, but as I said at the beginning, I like to think of myself as a realist.
Thanks, Neil. Hazel, I'm going to ask our Mayor of Penzance, Jonathan Howe, to present you with a challenge. Jonathan.
Okay, yeah, thanks to both of you, by the way. Yeah, my question really is about the predictability of the drilling, and I'm aware that the drilling in Penzance for the Jubilee Pool project met a bit of a fast-flowing water, I gather, and contractors decided to not proceed, or recommended not to proceed with the drilling, so they didn't go as deep as hoped for. and that had knock-on effects to the temperature of the water that came out. So I'm guessing that over time we will get more used to these things and have answers to them. But am I right there in that guess?
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah, so it's part of the job of the geology team behind the sort of the planning of a geothermal project to try and understand what's in the subsurface. So as I've said, every project is different, and in Cornwall, in the sort of the shallow subsurface, the top, I say shallow, even the top kilometre, obviously you've got mine workings, which in some places are pretty poorly mapped. So there can be some real difficulty for the geologists there trying to understand. Drilling through mine workings is obviously comes with its own difficulties. I'm not a driller, I'm not going to try and explain them. But it's really vital that we map everything we possibly can. But saying that, I mean, our well is the first well down to 5 kilometres. We will never truly know exactly what's happening at 5 kilometres beneath our feet. So as we're drilling, we have to react to what's happening. So the drillers, there's a whole team of them, they are watching every moment, every second, they are watching the panel as to seeing what's happening, seeing the data that's coming out and reacting to it accordingly. So absolutely, there's always possibility for an unknown formation. At United Downs, we hit a really massive quartz boulder, essentially, just a huge piece of quartz, which was incredibly hard, unexpected. You could never have predicted it. Even the best geologists in the world couldn't have done. So you really have to find a way around that. And there are different ways of doing it, depending on what you hit. I hope that helps answer your question.
Hazel, can I say to whoever's called iPad that Neil Wood has responded to your question in the chat, so you might want to have a look at that. But Neil, Andrew Brown's question, you've picked up on the first bit, but do you want to pick up on the last bit? Because that's quite interesting. I assume, actually, Andrew, why don't you explain a bit about what you mean by the very last sentence? Because that is quite a challenging and interesting topic, if I'm understanding it correctly. Andrew.
That you're talking about the disruptive technology.
Yeah,
thing.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. To give an example, you can take the example perhaps of the massive change as a result of things like the mobile phone, then developing into the internet, which has led to the ability to download programs, etc., etc. No one really saw that coming. And when the two technologies crossed over, most people's projections about growth went out the window. I was in the motor industry all my life, and I used to take projections of sales to my boss in Italy, and it was an 800-page marketing document, and he'd read it, and he'd look at it, and he'd say, I don't want 180,000 vehicles from you, Brown. What I want is 200,000. And then if you added that 200,000 to all the motor manufacturers' projections for the year, it became totally unrealistic. But of course, the factories geared up for it. Hence, we had fields full of cars that didn't sell. My point is that most of these projections are false, excuse me. And in the context here, if I look outside my window, I can see they're drilling exploratory for tin. Well, tin is under some threat, I would suggest, from nanotechnology, from the fact that the company that's doing this is not the company that has said that by 2026, they will be able to produce as much tin as the UK needs. So to me, the government and the local government needs to take charge of this sort of thing, because we cannot go on pulling stuff from the earth that we don't actually need. That's my point.
Yeah, that's fine. Neil, thank you for that, Neil. Do you want to have a go at that? And particularly around the, you'll know about wheel ore more than anybody, or as much as anybody, other than those living right on top of it. And obviously you kind of touched on that briefly, Andrew, in terms of, do we need the copper and tin that they hope to extract?
Okay, yes. Yeah, Andrew made a very good point. There are some very good companies out there. I've had to condense it down into 10 minutes. I've had to be very general in my approach. There are some very good world-class worldwide companies out there, Anglo-American, etc., who apply worldwide standards, whatever country they're working in. But you're right about things changing out of the blue. So for instance, if you went 20 years ago, there would have been minimal demand for tantalum, which I used just now, but with touchscreen technology being the rage these days, tantalum now has quite a market. And a large amount of the tantalum supply actually now is effectively conflict tantalum, which is problematic for everybody, but not too many people ask where it actually comes from. When it comes to the more basic metals like copper and tin, I think those are actually quite different, copper and tin. Copper is very much a bulk metal, and small-scale copper mining it's very, very uneconomic. So the likes of Rio Tinto, for instance, are only going to be looking at really large copper deposits. And the problem with large copper deposits is that we've pretty much accessed or know about all the fairly shallow, easy to get to ones. So now they're starting to look at much deeper deposits. And the reason that they're looking at these much deeper, large deposits is because copper is required in large volumes. As long as we're trying to shift electricity from A to B, we're going to need an awful lot of copper cabling. Tin is a slightly different one in that tin tends to be used in lower volumes than copper. But as long as we want electronics, we're probably going to be using tin. And again, if you go back 50 years, you'd have probably said, oh, there wouldn't be so much requirement for tin in electronics because we've got lead. But with the problems with lead and then displacing lead from solder, tin now has a much bigger role to play. I think when it comes to look at what the world needs, probably the best indicator is to look at pricing in the markets. And if you look at the price of tin at the moment, I don't think it's ever really been higher than it is now, which would suggest that demand is pretty strong and expected to remain strong for some time. Right? There's no guarantee that it's going to be strong forever. That's one of the risks of the mining industry, in that it's a long lead time industry. You invest a lot of money, it's a lot of years before you get anything back, and you just hope that people want what you're producing when you're actually producing it. I think the prospects for tin are pretty good for some time out, though, simply because of the demand from the electronics industry.
Thanks, Neil. Tim, I'm not going to dodge a question, but I do think you're proposing a whole session with your question. But what I would say is we certainly are trying to catch up of years of inaction or not enough action in relation to renewable energy policy. We're also, the scale of the challenge is massive. I mean, if you look at all the offshore wind ambition that the government has at the moment, that will deliver, or should deliver by the end of the decade, energy for 10 million homes. But there's still an enormous amount of homes and businesses and other schools, etc., that would need energy. So the challenge is massive. But I would absolutely agree that we need to do more and make it much easier. I'm finding, I'll mention your planning bit in a minute, but I'm finding just getting solar panels on my roof in my property, the process has already probably taken about 7 or 8 months. In fact, I met, and it's nothing to do with Naked Solar, I met Naked Solar in an event in Pendeen, spoke to it about it then at first, and we're not there yet. There's various reasons for that. On the geothermal planning, Hazel might not want to get involved in this, but Cornwall Council do seem to be taking a much more stricter, not detailed, but are asking geothermal or Hazel's company to do stuff that might not be being asked of elsewhere in the country on similar things. And so we do need to allow things to adapt, to respond to new technologies much more quickly. I've been at Truro College today, where they've launched their new skills centre, really, and it's all looking at new technologies. And the big point there was legislation is so far behind the curve of when these things are, as these things are moving on. But I think Cornwall Council probably have got the powers within planning policy to move things on much more quickly than they have. I'd agree that it's the planning around geothermal is unnecessarily challenging, difficult. But Hazel, I'm not inviting you to respond, but if you want to. I don't think anyone from Cornwall Council on here, and to be fair, I've raised it at the planning anyway, so they know my view on it. But it's entirely up to you if you comment.
I'll just chip in very quickly. I mean, I completely appreciate that planning has to be a very thorough process, and we have to make sure that developers are held accountable across every sector. And I don't think it is just Cornwall Council. I think renewable energy schemes across the country are facing challenges in many different counties. But yes, we are being held to new standards, which are unexpected. And but we'll continue pushing on.
But the pace is the issue, isn't it? As well as the new standards that you weren't expecting or haven't seen elsewhere.
Yeah, well, absolutely, exactly. I mean, we're all very for, trying to battle climate crisis, along with the energy crisis at the moment. Energy costs are rising exponentially, and we have the power in the UK to generate our own electricity from many different sources, and geothermal being one of them. And it is critical, it's vital, and we should be acting quicker. Absolutely.
Great, thanks. So Beth, over to you.
Yes, I was just wondering, maybe more for Neil, and because Hazel was talking about how they're trying to increase the biodiversity whenever you're in the area, which is incredible. I just wondered, Neil, if you could just shed a bit of light on how we can make sure to protect nature when other different types of mining are being done. Because maybe it's an old-fashioned view of mining, but I can imagine it to be very disruptive. And how do we make sure that biodiversity isn't affected, or that actually is that possible in other types of mining?
Now, that's a really important question. And probably the best way to look at that is to ask ourselves, well, how does mining interfere with biodiversity? Now, clearly, in the first place, a mine has got some kind of a footprint. But anything you build has got some kind of a footprint that affects that immediate area. The problem we have with heavy industry like mining is that it extends beyond that footprint, usually through issues with water and airborne contaminants, and those tend to affect the surrounding area. You can also have issues with noise, traffic, etc. Now, with modern technologies done properly, we have much better control over water contamination than even when I was a youngster, I remember the Red River flowing into St Ives Bay. Well, that's no longer red, and probably a very, very good thing, certainly in terms of the biodiversity for the bay around St Ives. So we now have the technology to process water so much better. And if you look at the reopening of South Crofty, that's all based around dewatering the mine through quite a complex and effective water remediation plant. So I'm quite happy that what goes into the Red River from Crofty in future will be probably a lot better than it's been in that water for as long as I've been living. When it comes to airborne contaminants and simply waste distributed around the place, one of the problems we have with legacy mining here in Cornwall is simply that there was no real attention to what you did with mine spoil. So, for instance, you don't have to look too far to find mine dumps around the place. Modern mining practices actually now use a lot of that spoil to backfill paste underground. So clearly you're taking a lot of volume of rock out from the ground. What is done now to help with geotechnical stability in the ground as well is that you can turn that rock you've extracted into a sort of, or if you like, for want of a better word, a form of concrete, pump that down into the empty voids that you've put underground, and you are both strengthening the ground and eliminating the surface waste problem at the same time. So there are lots of different approaches, which mean that when it's done properly, modern mining has a much, much lower impact beyond the footprint of the mine itself. Whereas previously and with poor mining, the impact goes way beyond the footprint of the mine.
Thanks, Neil.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. Are you nodding, Beth? Yeah, sorry, I had the chat function on. I'm going to go to you, Rupert, not to ask your question, but to say that you're not wrong about the Red River, but I remember as a boy, it was horrendous. And so the improvement has been massive. Although we've got issues in Porthleven where we could maybe apply the same technology. But I'm going to go over to Maggie Freegard, who's got a question for Hazel. And then after that, straight to you, Jonathan, about your completely bonkers question, Jonathan. Okay, so first Maggie and then Jonathan.
Hi, thanks for a brilliant talk. I've heard that geothermal could produce enough electricity to power Cornwall. I just wondered if that's true. And if so, is there a time limit for this? How long does this power source keep going?
Yeah, great question, Maggie. Thank you. So geologically, the resource that's available absolutely could power all of Cornwall. There was a really interesting report that I recommend people reading, came out last year by the Renewable Energy Association, which was looking at the UK as a whole. And it said that I think it was something like 300 odd gigawatts could come from geothermal energy from the UK alone, which without a doubt would power the whole of the UK, not just Cornwall. The challenge is the planning, as we've heard, getting power plants, power generation sites, whatever you would like to call them, across the line is difficult. That's partly due to the economics as well. We don't have any form of investment. All of our future sites will come from private investment. So you're asking people to put a lot of money in what they perceive as a new technology, even though, as I've said, it's all over the world already. So yes, in theory, it'll be difficult in practice. And then to the second part of your question was how long the resource would last. Again, geologically, the resource could go on forever. If you manage your geothermal system correctly, i.e. you're not just injecting cold water straight into where you're sucking it out of, the heat is going to be regenerating all the time. You're talking about over tens of thousands of years, potentially millions of years. So on a human timescale, that's excellent. What can be limiting to the timescale of a well is generally the steel casing that is inside the well. So sometimes you have to either replace it, which can be incredibly difficult. More likely is you actually have to re-drill the resource. So this steel casing can last anywhere between sort of 50 years and beyond.
Okay, Neil, so I suppose my question really is, are people even seriously considering asteroid mining? Because it just seems to me just the energy costs of transporting those materials back to our planet would just be ridiculous, make it ridiculous.
Actually, it's a really interesting area, and I don't claim to be a space scientist. I think logic tells us that as we start running short of a resource, we start looking further afield. What I think is likely to happen before we start mining in space is that we'll start mining under the oceans. And that's a whole different topic that's probably another session of these for Derek, I think. But it's well known in mining companies that one of the best places to put a mine is on an asteroid impact site. Because you're liable to find a very good source of iron and other interesting metals. I don't think there's going to be much point going to asteroids for iron because we don't really have a shortage of iron. We're going to run out of other things first. But when it comes to some of the rarer elements with very, very high unit values, it starts looking attractive. And if you'd asked me this question 20 years ago, I'd have said utterly ridiculous. But now if you look at what the likes of Elon Musk are doing, that we might have said 5 years ago just weren't sensible or viable, and now suddenly things are starting to happen with you know, pretty much everybody now potentially a space tourist, or if you've got the money, you're potentially a space tourist. More satellites than you can shake a stick up out there, then it is starting to look as though perhaps it might be feasible for some of the higher value metals, particularly if you can find cheap ways of doing it. For instance, having a device which accesses the asteroid belt, and then rather than pick up an asteroid and carry it back home, simply throws it back in our direction to be picked up by something else closer to Earth. So on paper, there are ways that look attractive. We're still some way off making it economically viable, but I wouldn't bet against it.
Okay, thank you.
I would suggest probably not in our lifetime, though, Jonathan. So what I'm going to do, so I'm hoping Beth can capture the questions that we haven't yet answered. And what we might do is collate those and send them out to you, Hazel and Neil. And if you've got some time, it'd be great if you could have a go at them. But I thought Neil and Hazel, you might just want 1 minute to round up before we close, and then I'm going to hand over to, I've lost him now. Is it Brian? Yeah, Brian. I'm going to hand over to Brian to just do a bit of a plug for his event on the 28th. So Neil, did you have 30 seconds of final thoughts?
All right, I'll try not to be too pessimistic. Look, we are blessed with mineral resources left here in Cornwall. I was underground as recently as last week, looking at some of them. We should, I think, be looking to exploit them. But if we are going to exploit them, we need to do it responsibly, and we need to make sure that there is not just an absolute minimum of environmental damage. We also need to make sure we get the maximum economic benefit for Cornwall and for UK PLC, and we need to make sure that we are having the right standards applied and the right level of education so that we can apply those standards and send them out around the world.
Great. Write the government's white paper on it, Neil. Hazel.
Thank you. Yeah, just to thank everyone here for being here and listening to us talk on about the things we love. Just to say, I think it's so important, particularly now with the current climate, in that we really utilise what the planet has given to us, utilise our homegrown resources, utilise our homegrown talent as well. You know, for years, someone mentioned it in the chat, you know, we've been drilling for oil and gas for decades. We've been able to, you know, harness the energy that way. We can use that skill, that talent in drilling to harness a much cleaner energy right here in Cornwall. So I think it's really exciting, and yeah, please do fire me any questions. We'd love to hear them.
Brilliant, Hazel. Thanks very much.